Good morning from Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Welcome to this special webinar we're hosting today entitled Syria After Assad, Domestic and Regional Challenges. I'd like to welcome our international audience. Several hundred people have opted to join us, so welcome. And we look forward to a productive discussion with our panelists and with you in this program. By way of introduction, let me just say that covering the Middle East, whether as a professional analyst, journalist, or researcher, is always interesting and engaging. I can tell you it's never boring. The last 10 days have been an example. We have witnessed a magnitude 10 earthquake on the geopolitical Richter scale of regional politics. On December 8th, to be specific, December 8, 2024, a coalition of Syrian rebel forces took control of Syria's main governorates, including Homs, Hama, Aleppo, Idlib, and Damascus, ending more than 5 decades of authoritarian Ba'ath Party and Assad family rule in the country. 13 years after the revolution began, the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who inherited the presidency from his father, Hafiz al-Assad, back in 2000, ended abruptly as Bashar fled to Russia, where he and his family were granted humanitarian asylum. Frankly, many questions have been raised by analysts, by researchers, by the media. Many questions and challenges remain for both Syria and other stakeholders, be they regional or international powers with interest in the region and specifically with interest in Syria. Key among these questions are, how are the opposition forces, how were the opposition forces able to take over Syria so quickly? I mean, what happened? All of a sudden, a hiatus of some sort for 12 years or more, and then all of a sudden the balance of power in the country shifts, causing this change. Why did the Assad regime's military and security institutions collapse so quickly without much of a fight? What is the current state of affairs in Syria? Who's running the country? Who are these new faces we're seeing on television and being interviewed about their vision for the country? These and many other questions that we hope to focus on over the next 50 minutes. And then we will also leave some time for our audience to engage with you, our panelists, in the art of conversation with their own questions. So feel free, if you're participating in this program, to use the Q&A feature in the Zoom, at the bottom of the Zoom page, to send your questions, and I will be more than delighted to identify you and read your question to the particular panelists. So Arab Center, Washington, D.C. is proud to convene this panel of experts today to try to unpack these questions that I just listed and many other questions, including yours, as we explore together the challenges facing Syria and discuss in a conversational format today, no statements per se, just a conversational format, the implications, if you will, for the region. Again, my name is Khalid Jahshan. For those who just joined us, I'm Executive Director of Arab Center, Washington, D.C. And we are very honored to have with us colleagues and friends. Let me introduce them before we proceed with the discussion or the conversation. First is Marwa Dawoudi, Associate Professor, and Saif Ghubash Chair in Arab Studies at Georgetown University. She's also a member of the Academic Advisory Board at Arab Center, Washington, D.C. Thank you for joining us, Marwa. Natasha Ho, a Senior Fellow with the Middle East Program at the Center for Strategic International Studies, CSIS, here in Washington. Welcome, Natasha. My friend and colleague, Marwan Kobalan, who is the Director of Political Studies at Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, ACRPS, in Doha, Qatar. Welcome, Marwan, and thank you for joining us. And last but not least, our own Radwan Ziadi, a face familiar to all of you at Arab Center, who's a senior fellow at Arab Center here in Washington, D.C. So we will, like I said, spend the next 50 minutes in discussion and conversation, and then we'll open it up for Q&A from the audience. But feel free, if you have a question in the interim, feel free to enter that, as I said, either through the Q&A feature or email it to Arab Center, to email arabcenterdc.org. Email arabcenterdc.org. It will be brought to my attention, and I will be delighted to convey that to all the panelists or to a specific member of the panel. Let me begin with the first question, and I'm going to open this first question to all four. I'd like to hear from all four panelists. How were the Syrian opposition forces able in recent weeks to take over the country so swiftly and effectively after 13 years of rebellion and civil war against the regime that were reasonably, I guess we can fairly say, somewhat quiet for a while? Then all of a sudden, this flame starts, and they have taken over the country. Let me start with you, Marwa, if you don't mind, and then I'll give every one of all four of you a chance to tackle this one main issue. Go ahead, Marwa.
Yes, thank you, Khalil, for the invitation. I think we had a two-level game here, which played in conjunction in making all of this happen. I believe the domestic situation was increasingly dire. The Syrian army, the soldiers were increasingly demoralized. They were underpaid. They got $17 a month. There was no stamina or appetite for fighting, even though the Assad regime tried at the last minute to increase their salary as it was being, attacked from different fronts. It was not sufficient to bring that sort of big resistance that was expected from the army. Also, internally, the food, water insecurity, the very dire economic situation created a sort of internal collapse, in my view, in conjunction with the regional dynamics. I think also since Gaza happened, the genocide in Gaza, the weakening of Iran, the weakening of Hezbollah, also put the Assad regime in a very weak position, and also at odds with its own sponsor, Iran. I mean, at the same time, it was not really supporting Iran in the same way that it used to be. There was a lot of suspicion between the two partners in recent years as Iranian commanders were being targeted by Israel within Syria. So I would say this conjunction of domestic and regional factors has really combined together to make that takeover almost bloodless and no resistance on the part of the regime. And I believe also a lot of back-channel negotiations between Assad and his surroundings and the Russian sponsor as well and protector to find a way out, which in my view has been in negotiation since several months and not a recent event as we've seen displayed in the news.
Thank you, Marwa. Natasha, would you mind responding to the same question and maybe just add a little bit about was the U.S. surprised by these results?
Yeah, and thank you for the invitation. I'll try to build on Marwa's excellent points. I mean, I think that everything would be surprising in Syria. I mean, I think an unbearable, so the fragility of this unbearable status quo for people on the ground, but also I think for Assad's allies and foes, it is really only surprising to those who aren't facing that reality on the ground. And the reality was that the United States was not dealing with those consequences. So I do think it came as a shock. I mean, we saw that the United States, up until the end was working with the UAE to perhaps lift sanctions on the Assad regime in return for Assad curbing arms shipments to Hezbollah and distancing itself from Iran, which was always, I think, the point of the UAE's normalization with Assad starting in 2018. And Marwa alluded to this, that, essentially, I think Iran and others got wind of these back-channel negotiations, and they no longer wanted to fight for Assad. I don't think the Russians were ever particularly tied to Bashar al-Assad himself. I think they were tied to a regime in which they could remain, sort of have a foothold, remain. And so it's sort of, I think we're still waiting to see what happens with the two bases that the Russians have along the western coast, which, I think were not just important as a launching pad for Russia into the Mediterranean and Africa, but I do think that their military intervention in 2015 was really the reemergence of Russia as a great power. So I do think it's a humiliating defeat. But back to, I think, the sort of domestic piece of this, which I think is a little bit hazier for a lot of people. We know that there has been a regional breakdown in the balance of power. Israeli attacks essentially decimating Hezbollah's rank and file in recent months. Russia obviously distracted with Ukraine, and I think really wanting to focus on that as the priority before the Trump administration to get as much land as it can before there's some kind of peace deal or ceasefire. But within the country, I think we really saw a dying animal, basically, in the regime. It was a regime that was almost cannibalizing itself. So, I mean, if I was talking to friends who are in Aleppo City, for example, it was just a pure mafioso state where people were trying to shore up their own, dismal incomes, as Marwa was saying, by trying to get bribes from various people. And up until now, we see former regime officials stealing documents from Sednaya prison and other prisons so that they can sort of sell it, still sort of negotiating over Austin Tice and other disappeared people. So the exploitation is up until this moment. And I think people just got tired of it. There was nothing left to fight for anywhere in the country.
Thank you, Natasha. Marwan, were you as surprised as the rest of us in the events of the past 2 weeks?
First of all, thank you, Khalil, for this timely event, for inviting me to this timely event. The attack was not a big surprise. The collapse of the regime was the surprise, in my opinion, because we have been hearing about preparation by the opposition throughout the summer. And we have been expecting the opposition to launch an attack against the regime, taking advantage of the Hezbollah collapse in Lebanon and also the weakening of Iran and its militias in Syria. And we have all been expecting the opposition to do something like attacking the regime. And also, as maybe Marwa mentioned, the weakening of Russian forces in Syria, because, since the Ukraine war, Russia started to withdraw parts of its forces in Syria, mainly the Air Force. So we thought that the opposition might take this opportunity and launch an attack against the regime, and they did, actually. But they were also surprised. The opposition itself was surprised by the collapse of the regime, because the initial objective of the attack was actually to push the regime, the forces away like 10, 15 kilometers, so that they cannot actually bombard the opposition locations and positions in Idlib. But when the regime forces collapsed, actually they thought that why not actually just carrying on and enter Aleppo, and that was the shock. So this is something that we need to keep it in mind. Plus, most of the Hezbollah was, as Marwa and Natasha actually mentioned, that the regime forces were demoralized over the past few years. The fighting force for the regime actually was Hezbollah. The regime forces were not fighting actually over the past few years. They were only acting as supporting units rather than taking care of logistics, supplies, but not fighting. Yeah. So when Hezbollah actually withdrew most of its forces from the countryside of Aleppo and Idlib, and the Russian Air Force was not there actually to support regime forces, so the collapse actually happened. And there is also another point that we don't have answers to it. It's about the internal dynamic of the regime, because I've heard it actually from many people talking about high-ranking officers within the regime itself, because we don't really know who gave the orders to the Syrian forces in Aleppo to withdraw and not fight. So that was a big question mark. And I think the answer to that is for some, when the opposition started their attack in the western countryside of Aleppo, Bashar al-Assad was not in Damascus, he was in Moscow. And there was the rumors actually that he left the country. That maybe led to further demoralization of the Syrian forces, because they thought actually that since he's not in Damascus, he's in Moscow, during such a big attack by the opposition. So people started questioning his commitment actually to his regime itself. So and he spent 4 days actually. That was also, he stayed in Moscow for 4 days before actually coming back to Damascus to meet the Iranian foreign minister. So that was also demoralizing for his own supporters, because staying in Moscow for 4 days also led many actually to question what the hell is he doing in Moscow while actually this big attack is taking place in Aleppo. Of course, Aleppo was a major blow to the regime forces, because the opposition managed to take it within 2 days, whereas the Syrian regime forces, supported by Iran, Hezbollah, and other Shiite militias and the Russian Air Force, it took them many years actually to retake Aleppo from the opposition. We know that the opposition actually, they took control of eastern Aleppo in 2012. The regime managed to take it back only in 2016. So they spent 4 years actually trying to regain Aleppo. The opposition took it in 2 days. That was a shock and awe attack, in fact, for many within the regime, and led to actually to the collapse of its forces.
It's interesting, Marwan, you mentioned that even the rebels were surprised by the swift.
Yeah, everybody was surprised, yes.
Left. But to me, what was interesting is seeing that statement, if it's credible, that Assad issued yesterday, in which he states that he was surprised, or the fact that he was taken aback, kind of whining that the troops will not fight. That's why I had to leave. Is that a credible assessment on his part?
When the attack actually started, I know that he was in his way to Moscow, from Damascus to Moscow. He was called while en route to Moscow, and he was told that there was an attack in Aleppo, but he thought that attack actually was just like previous ones, okay? It can be rebuilt and everything will be fine. So he just continued his flight to Moscow. When he arrived to Moscow, the news started to come out that Aleppo was actually taken by the rebels. That was a shock for him. So he decided to stay in Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin. But Putin was not in Moscow. He was in Kazakhstan, in Astana, attending a summit there. So he needed actually to stay for another day in order to meet Putin, who had to come actually next day. So anyway, he spent these 4 days actually in Moscow. And the lightning attack by the opposition was so quick, to the extent that rebels actually were on the gate of Hama within 4 days. When he arrived in Damascus to meet the Iranian foreign minister, actually the big battle actually happened in Hama. And I don't agree that there was almost no fighting during this conflict. There was no fighting in Damascus, but there was big fight actually took place in Hama, on the gate of Hama. And the opposition actually, they lost more than 300 people, 300 of their fighters actually, in an ambush by the regime forces, while actually trying to defend the Zain al-Abidin mountain, which was the stronghold of the regime forces. But when Zain al-Abidin mountain fell to the opposition, actually that was the end of the Hama battle. And this is when the opposition managed to take Hama. Hama was a hugely symbolic defeat to the regime. knowing that what Hama actually meant for Syrians. And then they went actually to Homs and from Homs to Hama. But when Homs actually, when the battle for Homs started, actually the Russians and the Iranians came to the conclusion that they won't be able to do anything actually to save Assad. Here was where the some sort of a compromise. This is what Hakan Fidan actually said yesterday. There was this conversations or negotiations between the Turks, the Iranians, and the Russians that maybe it's time to save the Syrian blood this time and find an exit for Assad from power.
Yeah. Radwan, you're the author of a piece that came out today. It's still not posted. It will be posted in a few minutes. So it's fresh off the print press, if you will, entitled Deciphering the Quick Collapse of the Assad Regime. Would you like to talk about the key 4 points in your paper as to this quick collapse again that everybody has explained in their own way?
Thank you, Khalil. I think everyone before me, they mentioned to one of the points. The first one, of course, there is the two main factors, regional and international factors, and two more local factors. We'll start with the international that Natasha and Marwa talked about, especially Russia was very occupied in Ukraine. In September 2015, when they involved in Syria, they have more than 40 fighter jets. But when 28th of November 2024, they have only 4. That gives you a sense that Russia has a limited power to do the Air Force, and that was crucial for the Assad government and for the Iranian militias to regain most of the opposition territories in 2017 and 2018 and after. The second factor, and now we have 10 days after December 8th, too much documents has been relieved and we can put all pieces together. Reuters, they did actually a very important report when they managed to survey 17 high-ranking Assad officials. And all of them, they mentioned that we know, as Marwan mentioned, that since 2012, the Assad regime never fight in the north. Most of the doing the fighting, the Iranian militias and Hezbollah. In the Reuters report mentioned after the surveys that after 2015, when the Russia involved, most of the chain of the commands who gave the orders and the military strategic overview was were Iranian and Hezbollah fighters. Because of the defeat of the Hezbollah with Israel in the last 2 months, most of the fighter of Hezbollah, they left, and the Reuters, they mentioned almost 1,500. They left Syria back into Lebanon. At the same time, after the blow of the Iranian embassy in Damascus, most of the top commanders of the Iranian militias, they went back into Iran. That created a vacuum. They mentioned one of the battalion, they're supposed to have 150 soldiers with the Assad regime. They have on November 28th only 8 people there. And that's the second factor, where that most of the Iranian militias and the Hezbollah, they left out because they think after the ceasefire, the de-escalation zones agreement in Astana, there's no fighting anymore. And that's exactly in 2022, almost this agreement has been implemented forcefully by Russia and respected by Turkey. But the two main local factors, of course, and that's maybe added here, that's the organization that the opposition put for, militarily and the organization level. And today, as example, Ahmed al-Shara appointed 3 leaders of Ahrar al-Sham as a governor of Damascus suburbs and the governor of of Tartus and a governor of Hama. It means he understands the power sharing, and he actually responds to the pledge that this is not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham military force, but that's such kind of organization. And Ahmad al-Shara himself mentioned that we start putting together the plan a year ago. And they have the morale against what Marwa exactly mentioned about the morale within the Assad regime. No one interested fighting. And as I mentioned, from 150, they're supposed to be only 8 on the ceasefire line. But also they added many sophisticated weapons, especially with the drones. The drones make a difference. It's not such compared to the drones organized by the Israeli or the Turks or the American drones, but it did the job. It did the job very quick because it's been very precise, especially they have what the range 30 kilometers. And with the only fight it happened in Hama. In Hama, it's because Marwan is right that Aleppo was a surprise. And most of the regime forces, they got surprised by such organized attack. And this is the use of the drones. These drones in Hama, as example, they be able to kill the head of the security force, military force. And they hit actually the central command in Misyaf. Everyone got scared, and of course, they got injured of Suhail al-Hassan, who is the head of the battalion 25th, the most sophisticated and the most advanced, and the Assad regime used this battalion almost everywhere. And that's maybe created a shock within the Assad government, Assad military forces, that they coming up with the power. We have no way to defend it since, or the Iranian and the Hezbollah, they left. And the large, final factor which played very important, the morale, as I mentioned. And this is what the messaging of the opposition succeed very well. They call it the administration of the military operation, إدارة العمليات العسكرية. They work on 3 levels. The first level, the military level, that they have the organized. And this time, I mean, those groups who made of this military operation, they have a lot of history of infighting among each other. But now they got each other, and they have the plan for Aleppo exactly. This is why when they entered Aleppo, they executed the plan very perfectly to protect the state institutions, messaging to the minority groups, especially Christian and non-Muslims, and at the same time, stop any type of looting or anything happened. That's important for them to create the image that not everyone would get scared of them, like what's happened before when they got into Aleppo in 2012. That the messaging played very important role to be able actually to go into Homs and then go into Damascus as a concourse. And this is the messaging from Ahmad al-Shara himself also played an important role. We coming as a sons and daughters of those cities. We've been enforced to live outside. We've been enforced to be as refugees. Remember, almost 7 million Syrian are refugees, and there are 3 to 4 million displaced Syrian on the border between Syria and Turkey. And Ahmad al-Shara himself, he mentioned yesterday in very appealing speech that being a displaced is the most harming one. He lived it, and everyone he lived it. And he made the appeal and the promise that even to take every tent and we will rebuild the country until the last tent. And those actually made of the most of the rebels forces to go into Homs and Hama and Aleppo, and that's create the image among the Syrian and the Arab media, international media, that the rebel forces mostly, or those fighters who didn't displaced and now they return back. This messaging was very effective.
Yeah,
and those 4 different factors
Radwan.
played important role.
Yeah, we'll get into more detail about that. Thank you very much for your comprehensive answer. Natasha, let me ask you. Yesterday, I noticed the Washington Post reported that foreign powers seems to be jockeying for control in Syria, taking advantage, if you will, of what's taking place in there. And specifically, the article mentioned the U.S., Turkey, and Israel as engaged in bombing and maneuvering to kind of, if you will, in the pursuit of their own strategic interest in the country. What are these countries pursuing in Syria, particularly, of course, in a way, the U.S.?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, I think this is probably going to be the most consequential piece of this. We're already talking about, or at least in DC, people are talking about Syria being a failed state and different factions fighting one another. But I think the reality is that we're still in the struggle for Syria component of this phase, as Patrick Seal had once written a book about. You know, when you have a dying animal, it starts to cannibalize itself, but then others begin to devour it. And that's the kind of the phase that we're in today. And so we saw Israel basically annihilate the entire Syrian military, sort of under the argument that they are destroying strategic weapons depots and shoring up their own security. They went in through the Golan Heights, the demilitarized zone, continued to refute statements that they were just a few miles from Damascus. Well, in fact, they were, and they took Mount Hermon, which is about 25 miles away from Damascus, and it's the highest point on the Eastern Mediterranean coastal area. I highly doubt they're going to evacuate that area. They've said it's temporary. Israel has wanted that for a long time, so I seriously doubt that's what's going to happen. And then almost immediately after, we saw Netanyahu and others saying that they're going to further develop settlements in the Golan Heights, which is that area along the demilitarized zone, Israeli-occupied Syria. And then, of course, in the north, and a lot of people are talking about Turkey as the big winner here, as basically the power that probably green-lighted this rebel offensive in the first place. But what was notable, I thought, in the first days and until now of that rebel offensive was that the Syrian National Army, so the umbrella of sort of Turkish-backed armed groups, kind of stayed in the north and continued to move eastward to take more territory from the Syrian Democratic Forces. This is the sort of US-backed coalition of forces in northeast and eastern Syria that are dominated by the Kurds, which of course Turkey has long seen as a security threat to them. So we saw this SNA group move across the east, take Tel Rafat and Manbij, with the help of Turkish drones and air power. And we recently saw a US-backed ceasefire there. And so that leads me to the United States, the other actor that has sort of a stake in this with 900 troops, US troops in northeast and eastern Syria. It remains to be seen if President-elect Trump's isolationist tendencies will win the day, and whether or not he'll get his withdrawal of US troops, which he wanted in 2019, but was convinced by his generals not to go through with it. But I think the big issue there for the US is that the SDF, these Kurdish-dominated forces, they guard the ISIS prisons. So, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of ISIS prisoners are still there in the Northeast. And when the SDF has felt vulnerable before, we have seen prison breaks. And so it is likely that they could play that card again. So the US immediately sort of entered that fray and brokered a ceasefire. But it remains to be seen how long that will last. And I certainly don't think it will last if the US withdraws their troops. But I think, you know, to your larger point, of course, there's, you know, Iran, not clear what they're going to try to do here. I think it will be very difficult for them to interfere in Syria for some time now. Russia, I think, is also just trying to maintain its bases at this point, hopefully, while it focuses on Ukraine and sort of unrest in its near abroad. But I think those are the major stakeholders here, of course. But I think it shows how much this is this conflict stopped being about Syrians a long time ago when Antony Blinken from Aqaba, met with pretty much every actor except for Syrians recently. And so I think that says a lot about the challenges that Syrians are going to face in the next few days and months and years ahead.
Definitely. Thank you, Natasha. Marwa, who's running the country now, Syria, and what are their prospects in terms of stabilizing the country under this difficult and challenging situation?
So I just want to add to the point made by
Sure.
Natasha about the US. I thought it was very interesting. It's worth mentioning also that Israel is occupying all of the Syrian land in blatant violation of international law, right? And also in violation of an agreement brokered by the US themselves in 1974. And what we've seen is also President Biden very quickly giving his seal of approval to Israel's illegal occupation just yesterday, despite all the talk about norms and human rights, etc. So this is a very worrisome development. I think the Israelis seized the opportunity, of course, and I think they tested the ground, and they knew that the new government in Syria needed to consolidate its power, its transition, before being able to confront this foreign aggression and invasion of its territory. I think the plan is also for the Israelis to double their settlements, illegal settlements again. There are 30,000 Jewish settlers in the Golan, in the Syrian Golan. Israel tries to pioneer itself as a renewable energy, pioneer in terms of wind farms, which are on stolen land in the Syrian Golan, sort of normalizing its occupation. All of that will be very lot of pressure on this new transition. And to go back to your question, Khalil, I think Jolani Ahmed al-Shara has, in my view, a tight control on the situation domestically. He's not, and as Marwan and Radwan mentioned, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham was not the only one taking over power. We know there was a coalition of forces coming from the south as well, taking from the north and the south, taking the capital over. And it seems so far he's the man in charge. The question here is, how will he be ruling? His appointments are symbolic. He's giving some agency to other groups and fighters, creating his speeches are very inclusionary. And I'm thinking strategically in terms of the other groups and opposition groups and armed groups, which used to fight each other as well, to bring that new Syria in a very cohesive and strong structure. He's also trying to be inclusionary when it comes to different groups. He doesn't project himself as a rebel Sunni leader. He's talking about the respect of ethnic and religious minorities and reaching out to them. I know that some Alawis also have taken stances in Lad'i in support of the new government. So there is hope here if this continues, that there will be an inclusionary transition to democratic rule. There will need to be elections, of course, but in that transition phase, I think there needs to be a strong ruler such as Jolani to bring all factions together. And really, we've seen in Syria in the last 13 years a very, very, very bloody conflict. There was a lot of blood spilled. There is a potential for this to happen anytime. So there is a need here to have some tight control under a strong hand. And at the same time, I think talking about the invasion by Israel, the attack by the Americans also on the eastern part of the country, the fact that Turkey has boots on the ground in the north as well, and there are still military bases by Russia, foreign interference will be an added challenge for that new government. And I think Jolani people were expecting him to make an earlier statement about the Israeli invasion. And he did say this was illegal and that he would fight for Syria's sovereignty, but he was dealing with the domestic situation at the moment, consolidating limiting his power, and that he could not fight two fronts at the same time. But I believe the Syrian people will be waiting to hear more about what is going to be done and how the new government will react to it. I don't think they will be armed, reaction, but clearly, at least already in the statement, that was symbolically important, as there had been a vacuum so far and no reaction from the part of the new ruling government.
Thank you, Marwa. Just to help illustrate, I think, the point you just made with regards to the newly emerging occupation in the Golan. I just noticed an article this morning in Haaretz in which the Israeli writer says the villagers in the militarized zone have begun calling Israel's control over large strategic sections of the Syrian Golan an occupation, and they are wondering whether it will be temporary or indefinite. So I think it's changing the rules of the game.
With Israel, it's never temporary, as we know, right?
Exactly.
They occupied the July 1967. They annexed it in 1981. It's still an illegal occupation under international law. No one recognizes the occupation except under the Trump administration when he made that statement. But that is the only power internationally which has recognized it.
Marwan, tell us a bit about the Aqaba meeting. What were the implications there for Syria? And maybe if you could expand a little bit on Arab state or official reaction to the events in Syria.
Yeah, thank you, Khalil, for raising the issue, because this is extremely important right now for the Syrian question. And I believe the Aqaba summit or meeting actually was an attempt by the external powers to take control or actually to control the course of events on the ground in Syria, because they lost control. In fact, in the past couple of weeks, everybody, as we said earlier, was taken off guard by the developments in Syria. Everybody was preparing itself to live with Assad in power, and some Arab countries even would prefer Assad to stay in power rather than having an alternative, like, for example, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. So the Aqaba meeting actually was somehow a meeting organized to try to control politically, let's say, what they lost on the ground militarily, as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham has taken control. So they decided to invoke Resolution 2254 in order to have some sort of international, let's say, some sort of an international administration of Syria, composed of Arab countries, the US, the EU, Turkey, mainly, and some Syrians actually they don't like this at all, because they believe that since Syrians managed to bring Assad down alone without any external support. And I would like Khalil to underline this issue, because some people believe that Turkey was behind this, which is not true. Turkey was not in favor of the military operation by the opposition, and they tried to stop it from the very beginning, because they have this understanding with the Russians, and they want actually to respect that understanding with the Russians. They reached in 2020. But then the Turks actually, when they saw the opposition actually demolishing the Assad forces and reaching Hama, and when Hama fell to the opposition, they decided actually to take advantage, to take some credit for that attack. And then this is where the Turks decided to support the Syrian opposition, because it was clear actually where things are moving. Another thing, let me just another issue on Resolution 2254.
Yeah.
Resolution 2254 actually stipulates that the opposition and the regime should come together and establish a governing body. Yeah. Right now, the regime has been overthrown. It's no longer there. The opposition has become the regime. Okay, let's say the ruling party in Syria. So there is for some Syrians, including myself, actually, we see no point actually of invoking Resolution 2254, but actually to give the external power a tool to control the political process in Syria, which I believe Syrians are grown up enough to manage the transitional period. Especially now, everybody is trying actually to put some sort of pressure as Syrians on Jawlani in order to have an inclusive political process, and not trying actually to exclude the forces, the other political forces, because we all believe that the collapse of the Assad regime did not come actually on the December 8th. It started on March 18, 2011. And it's an accumulative process that ended up actually with the Jawlani and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham taking advantage of the weakness of the regime, the weakness of its allies, in order to bring it down. The last point that I would like to mention, Khalil, because in fact, because Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and the other opposition factions, they were themselves surprised by their a quick victory. They suddenly found themselves in the seat of power in Damascus without having a vision what to do next, right? So this is why so far we have been the government of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, it changed its name like 4 times so far in 10 days. Interim government, caretaking government, salvation government. So in fact, they don't have a vision about the transitional period. We started to hear over the past couple of days that Jawlani is actually preparing for introducing certain amendments to the current constitution of Syria, which he suspended actually last week. And he's preparing afterwards, without actually the participation of the political opposition, but by actually bringing legal experts in order to change certain clauses within the constitution, and then have election, keeping the current political system as it is, a presidential system, which is the president have like huge power, and actually go for elections. And of course, he believes that he will be elected because everybody is giving him the credit now of bringing down down Assad. And this idea is not actually well received by the Syrian parts of the Syrian opposition, who started actually. This is the point, which is, I believe, important, and I believe it's very dangerous as well. This is where people like the coalition, the opposition coalition, they believe they are actually in favor of invoking resolution 2254 in order to find a place for themselves by the support of the external power within the political process inside Syria, i.e. Seeking help from the external players to put pressure on Jawlani using resolution 2254 in order to force Jawlani to have them share in any power sharing formula. This is, in my opinion, very dangerous, as I see it, because that would mean replaying the external intervention in the Syrian internal affairs, the one that we saw during the militarization of the Syrian revolution, and also when the Arab countries and for many other countries, including the US and the EU, they decided to force more people within the coalition, the opposition coalition, for example, after Riyadh, in order to include people that they believe will actually support their own interests. So in this case, we are working for the interests of the external power rather than working for the interests of the Syrian people, or for a peaceful and safe transitional period in Syria.
So everyone is jockeying for position to enhance kind of external powers, jockeying for their position to enhance.
Absolutely. And some Syrians are being used as tools actually in order to enhance and the interests of the external powers. And this is, I mean, the dangerous point that I wanted actually to mention.
Yeah, thank you. Radwan, you've worked for years on the issue of accountability. Has Assad basically run away free of accountability by finding refuge in Russia? What's your kind of speculation, if you will? If you could give us maybe 4 or 5 minutes on this issue of accountability. What's next and what should be done, and how do you hold those who committed crimes against humanity responsible for their actions?
Of course not. I don't think he will be able, even in the future, to escape accountability. But the question, how we do the accountability and justice in Syria. This question is the center of Syria right now and the Syrian victims. After the collapse, after December 8th, we saw thousands of families of political prisoners who looking for their beloved one in Saydnaya, and the rumors everywhere. You see that people, they think there is a secret prisons everywhere, and we should use even some special tools to look under the ground to dig and discover those political secret prisons. Of course, this is heartbreaking for almost more than 150,000 political prisoners who are in Syria right now. And unfortunately, maybe most of those went missing. And that's add more challenges with the discovering of mass graves everywhere. Today, the news that they discover mass grave of almost more than 100,000 people they buried there. And this is why the question of accountability and justice will be a centerpiece in Syria for almost 10 years. And we saw that in other countries, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, most of the countries who have mass killings and mass war crimes and crimes against humanity, they have a very difficult managing that. And for Syria to take advantage of the other examples or other countries who went through the same process, we need the international help for sure. And this is why it all depends on legalizing or recognizing the interim government in Syria. If this interim government, who does not have a vision for the transitional period, does not have a vision about exactly what type of accountability we should pursue, it's very difficult for the international organization or even for the local organization to deal with the question. But from my talking to too many leaders in the current and other civil society organization, most of the Syrian, we going into more what we call it local justice experience rather than international experience. There is, of course, advantages and disadvantages. I'll start with the disadvantage, of course. It can be seen, this process, as maybe rigged and illegitimate of some of the eyes of the international organization or international observers, if does not actually meet the international standards, being focused on justice, non-sectarian, non-biased, have based on the evidences rather than have the accusation, and in all of that. And another, of course, disadvantage, it may be weaken the system for the long term if did not, because like some countries like Sierra Leone and Cambodia, they use this mechanism, international mechanism, to get more support for their country and more support, international support in the rebuilding and in an economic project. If Syria did that only domestically, we'll lose this long arm to the international community to help in that. But the advantage, of course, of that, we know that the international, this is very complicated and it is very slow one. It can, and of course, next to us, Lebanon is the best example of the international court of the killing of Rafiq al-Hariri, the prime minister. The court almost cost $2 to $3 billion, and they indicted 4 Lebanese. Lebanon never handed any of these, and all the work is being has no impacted anything on the justice system on the ground. If we spend the same amount of money to strengthen and to rebuild the justice system domestically, will be much better. And the last point, of course, of the advantage that the domestic court, last like after the genocide in Sierra Leone, there is 3 different levels. And now the Syrian new leadership focus on only what we call the big fish. That's the names, the president, his henchmen, the head of the army battalions, and the head of the security forces. And they mention 19 names to have a search for them and try them. And there, of course, there is a different levels of not only the decision makers, but also the assistants. It can be thousands of people. And some Syrians now, maybe they voices that they're angry that this leadership, they let them go. We saw now the videos of thousands of army in Tartus and Latakia. They give them up their arms and they get what they call temporary ID. And that's, they believe this one will give them some type of amnesty in the future. Most of the Syrian, maybe they're afraid of this. This is a process which focus more, I understand, on more peace building and more focus on stability rather than focus on accountability. This debate will stay with Syrians for maybe in the next 10 years, as we've seen in other countries.
Let me ask you this, Radwan. The act of liberation, if you will, the surprising developments of the past couple of weeks and several months actually before that, is that changing the ball game with regards to accountability, or is accountability still the same historic process that started, a dozen of years earlier?
No, to be sure, that's put us in much more advantage point, because before in 2015 and Security Council Resolution 2054, which focused on transition, the transition was more negotiation and have transitional body. Now with the total victory of the opposition, it can be implemented. It's a project for the transition as we planned before in 2011, accountability, justice, and all of that. I mean, this is a big advantage but there is, of course, a fear of transition, how it look like, because some of the people still fear that maybe it's infighting between the different groups will erupt. We saw that in Libya, we saw that in Yemen. It can be a possibility. This is why some of the Syrian, they believe that if we support the character of Ahmed al-Shara, who's now maybe unifying figure, that's the only difference between us and in Libya in 2012. That Libya, difficult to have unifying figure to be able to everyone to listen. And in this 13 years of the uprising in Syria, the Syrians, as I say all the time, are difficult and tough. They don't agree easily, and they don't. And to have unifying figure, it can be an advantage. It can be a good thing. He showed a level of wisdom to dealing with the different factors. But at the same time, we have to continue to press him on the transition. Till now, he never mentioned the word election or democracy as example. And there is a fear that among us that he has a plan is not exactly according to what we hope for as a democratic transition and to build a democratic Syria.
Talking about inclusive and representative government, Natasha, I would like to conclude the general conversation with this question addressed to you. At Aqaba, Our fearless Secretary of State Blinken mentioned or urged the new Syrian leadership, and I'm quoting him, to produce an inclusive and representative government that respects the rights of all Syrian citizens and seeks to meet their needs. Are these, from your perspective, realistic expectations at this time on the part of the United States, and particularly with the record we've had as a country in terms of what happened over the past 14 months in Gaza and in Lebanon?
Maybe I'll start with your last point. I think the question is whether or not the actions and the actual desires match the rhetoric. And I think what we've seen in the Middle East, not just in the past year and a half, but frankly for decades, is that the actions don't match the rhetoric or the sort of smaller scale efforts of the various sort of NGOs across the Middle East, like NDI. We know what the threat to democracy is in the Middle East, and I highly doubt it's Syrians themselves. Tens of thousands of Syrians have died for democracy over the past few years and continue to up and until just the past few months of Assad's reign, which is quite incredible. If you're thinking about the bravery, you have to work pretty hard to get your average American to get to the voting booth. So I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that many other countries in the Middle East see a functioning, inclusive democracy as a threat, if we're being very honest. And some of them are sort of autocratic regimes that do not want a flourishing democracy to give their own people the wrong idea. But then I think also for the United States and for Israel, the uncertainty of a democracy for Israeli security is just too much to bear. And we saw that in the aftermath of the Arab Spring right away, where we saw the then U.S. administration really have to, jump through hoops in order to avoid the words military coup when President Sisi came to power. So I think these are the major threats, to be honest, to an inclusive democracy. Abu Muhammad Jolani, we're calling him by his real name, but he's from the Golan Heights. I'm sure that doesn't make Israel feel very good because they are occupying the Golan Heights. So I think that they are very wary as well. And to me, the big question is whether or not these actors will support an inclusive democracy. I don't really necessarily see that happening. But whether or not they would want to see a stabilizing autocrat, the way we have in other countries, sort of hollow stability, but I guess what they deem stability, or chaos. And I think that's the real danger in Syria, because for many countries, chaos is preferable to something else. I think what I would be looking for from the U.S. administration, I mean, we're at the end of the Biden administration, so looking to the next administration, is whether or not they use the really substantive diplomatic tools that they have, like the designation of the terrorist organizations like HTS that essentially run Damascus now, or the sanctions, the heavy sanctions that have been imposed on Syria throughout the years. If they use that to really guide governance in an inclusive direction, to ensure, what the other panelists have talked about in terms of sort of the right timeline for elections, ensuring that others are able to campaign, ensuring that there's some kind of inclusivity of all of them, the diversity of Syria itself, both politically, ethnically, religiously. So we'll see, I think, if they do that. But again, I think that there are structural issues at play in the Middle East that aren't necessarily at play in places like Cambodia and Sierra Leone. So there are really significant challenges there. And so I think, the best case scenario right now is really shoring up, I think, Syria's economy, getting basic services up and running. These are things that people have not had for a long time, salaries, things like that, because there's a lot of spoilers here. and they are internal and they are external. And, you know, there are going to be a lot of disagreements about whether or not to continue to involve former regime officials in any kind of future Syria. I can tell you that people that I know who never were really with the opposition are furious at these, you know, these local councils that they have to deal with these former regime officials that they know were corrupt and sometimes, you know, committed human rights violations. So I think there's going to be a lot of those kinds of internal disagreements. And I also think it's going to be a challenge for the external opposition to make themselves relevant. A lot of these civil society bodies that have been working so diligently and hard over the past few years. So, you know, I think, again, the United States and Europe have, you know, really constructive role to play there. I think the question is, will they take this opportunity to do that? And I sincerely hope that they do.
Yeah. Thank you, Natasha. Thank you all for the art of conversation. Appreciate your frank and substantive answers to all these questions we have raised. Let's go ahead and tackle some of the questions directly from the audience. Starting, the first question that came was from Jenny Silver, basically saying, when do you think Israel will stop bombing Syria, and when will they stop seizing Syrian land in the Golan Heights? Who will stop Israel, particularly in light of the fact that her expectation is that Trump's policies might even be more permissive than what we have seen thus far in terms of allowing Israel a free hand to do whatever it wants to do. I'm going to avail these questions to all four, so just raise your hand and just to get my attention and go for it. This is that first question from Jenny Silver. When do you think Israel will stop basically the hundreds of bombings they have done in Syria? By the way, I would add to her question that Israel was not the first one or the only one. I mean, the US has also done hundreds of raids, right, on Syrian targets. Marwan, go ahead.
I have very short answer to that question, actually. Only when the balance of power actually shifts against Israel will stop actually bombing Syria. Because the Israelis have proven over the past many decades that when you are weak, actually, they don't listen to you. They don't actually stop striking you. So I think when Syria rebuild its army, I think this is where they are gonna stop, because from now on, I believe they are gonna day in, day out strike everywhere in Syria, as they have been doing this over the past actually 12 years, perhaps since 2013. So I believe nothing will stop actually Israel from doing this unless they fear the consequences of keep actually attacking Syria. That is my answer to that question.
Thank you, Marwan. Radwan, go ahead, and then Marwan.
Very quick 3 points. The first one, I think the ultimate goal of this is Israeli raids, which more than 500 now raids almost every day to weaken the transitional government. And there is in Syria a history of that. Remember, the first military coup in the region and in Syria in March 1949 was a response of the weak government in response to the Israeli violation of the truce agreement in 1949.
Except that we don't have an army to have a coup right now.
Exactly, but
it was a CIA-led coup, right? At the time,
it is not clear yet, but it may be.
The archives show it. Yes,
it may be, but because most of the Syrian, of course, against this Israeli raids, and I see that it is not only violation of the international law, it's destroying the assets of Syria in the future. I mean, there is, because the Israeli argument first, they target only the Iranian militias and the Iranian top leadership. And there is none now, right now. There is no reason for them to continue to do that. The second point that I think we surprised the United States. It supported the Israeli raids at the beginning and legitimized that. And now they changed the tone a little bit. What they said, we understand the Israeli concern, but it should other factors take into consideration. I think the United States should pressure Israel to stop these raids because that's not helping the transition. And it's clear that it's a weaken the government and give the chance for the critiques of the government to see, look, this is a new government. It's is not respecting the sovereignty of the Syria on the land or on the sky. And the fourth and the third quick points, Israel, unfortunately, it's hungry for land grabbing. They saw the opportunity and they violate the 1974 agreement. I think Syria for right now, for sure, will not be able to do any defense or any military operation for sure. And Ahmed al-Shara mentioned that already. But I think it should all friends of Syria and the United States, who it's mentioned that they need a peaceful transition and they need to help the Syrian in this transition to pressure Israel to stop this military raids ongoing every day.
Thanks, Radwan. Marwa, do you want to add something to that?
I just want to say this is typical of the politics of fait accompli by Israel. It has done it for decades in any Arab country, specifically with Syria. I think the purpose here, we have to say, is also the total destruction of the military power, Syria's military power. And they have destroyed the air force, the naval, all of any capacity for the new government to be in a position to counter any aggression, foreign aggression. And I have to say, the army in Syria is a major institution for Syria, and any future even a civilian state in the future, a democratic transition, the army remains a very important institution for Syria. So they saw a window. And I think Netanyahu also, nothing has stopped him since a year. The genocide in Gaza, the destruction of Lebanon, the ethnic cleansing in the occupied West Bank. Why wouldn't he go? He's on a roll. Why wouldn't he go and grab land and destroy the army? The US is backing him. And he's also facing a trial for corruption. And we're talking about a so-called democracy where the leader is facing a trial for corruption, which is clearly he's trying to divert the attention away from that trial and to show also further victory to his constituencies. I think the US have given their seal of approval, and I believe the Trump administration would continue to back Israel in that sense. So what would change it is that if you have a rise in radicalism, jihadism against Israel, unfortunately, what they purport to contest and to counter is going to be the backlash in the next few years, in my view.
Thank you, Marwa. Natasha, go ahead. You have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I was just, I think fait accompli is kind of the word. The thing that really struck me, I think, after the fall of Assad, which was this really stunning historic moment, was that immediately everyone came rushing to say it was going to be a failed state. Well, you do have a failed state if you completely destroy a sovereign country's military. And if we see any kind of reemergence of ISIS cells and whatnot, you now have a military that is unable to do anything about it. And so I think that that's really quite problematic. I think that when it comes to Israel, it seems like there are no red lines. And when it came to Assad, the red line was Israel, and he was able to maintain power for a very long time because of that. And so I think that, you know, to everyone's point, we likely won't see any kind of limitations or constraints on that Israel will take as long as the United States doesn't use its leverage on Israel in Syria or really anywhere else.
Okay, we have another question from Ian Drummond with regards to the situation in Syria. Is this not a major strategic victory for Netanyahu, as he has in fact claimed himself with the lame duck administration here in Washington, and essentially damaging the quote-unquote axis of resistance, splitting Arab ranks in different directions, particularly internally, Palestinian among themselves, Sunni versus Shia, secular versus religious. Is this really a victory for him?
I believe, Khalil,
yeah,
if
go
you
ahead.
allow me,
Please.
I believe it is a big victory. I believe that Netanyahu is the biggest winner at the end of the day because he dealt a major blow to the axis of resistance, if you want to call it that way, and to the Iranians. Right now, actually, he almost destroyed Hamas in Gaza, Hezbollah in Lebanon, and now he brought down Bashar al-Assad. But also, he is concerned about the replacement of Bashar al-Assad because he knew Bashar al-Assad and the Assad regime for the past 5 decades, and there was this sort of tacit understanding between the two parties that Syria will not be used as a launching pad against Israel. Now we have this new regime in Damascus, and he's a little bit concerned about the credentials of this new regime. He doesn't know whether this new regime will reflect, if the new regime is going to reflect the will of the Syrian people. We all know what the will of the Syrian people vis-a-vis Israel. Most Syrians actually, if not all of Syrians, would like actually to regain the Golan Heights. They would like actually to have Israel withdrawn actually from the Golan Heights. And that is something that Israelis wouldn't necessarily like. So this is what they have been doing over the past couple of days, over the past couple of weeks. Because Khalil, if you notice that the bombardment of the Israelis against Syria escalated mainly with the collapse of the Assad regime in Damascus. So he said that the disengagement agreement of 1974 was no longer actually effective exactly at the hour when Bashar al-Assad actually lost power. So here actually where he took advantage of the chaos, let's say, the vacuum in Syria, to destroy the military forces of Syria, to destroy the Syrian, let's say, army, and also to occupy more Syrian land. But ultimately, I believe he's the winner. If he now convinced Donald Trump actually to go after Iran, I think he would be culminating somehow his victory over the axis of resistance. So yes, I believe he's the biggest winner of all of that.
Yeah, and what's amazing is the excuse that the Israelis use to justify those raids. I thought it was very interesting that all official spokespeople for the Israeli government kept insisting that what they are hitting are what they considered damaging, and I'm quoting him, damaging strategic arms potentially harmful to Israel's interests. Now, what happened the last 3 weeks? How come these same weapons were not damaging or threatening to Israel's interests when they were under the control of the regime? All of a sudden, they became dangerous.
Exactly, Khalil, because they actually they knew actually that the Syrian regime would never perhaps use these strategic weapons against Israel, but now they might fall in the wrong hands. This is why actually they decided to launch this campaign against these weapons, to destroy these weapons.
Yeah, Marwa.
Yes, I just want to say clearly it's a victory for Netanyahu, the same way he managed to destroy and weaken a lot Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza. He's really projecting his power domestically and regionally. But I want to say, if you read the Israeli press and the conservative Israeli press, they are concerned. I mean, it's not in Netanyahu's advantage to have a weak Syria under the Assad regime, which is weakened, which is under sanctions, which he was able to go and bomb whenever it suited him. I mean, even the heart of Damascus a few months ago, killing people. So there was no limit there already. But I think it's not necessarily in the long term in their interest to have a change of regime. And when you read the press, you see they wanted Assad regime to be weak, but not to be weak to the point of being toppled, because then there's an unpredictable transition. And there is clearly, one has to realize also, the Syrian people are very, very opposed to the occupation of the Golan and also very much in support of Palestinian rights. So they will not be sympathetic to Israel. And I want to also counter, because a lot of analysts or supporters of the axis of resistance have argued that because it's a victory for Netanyahu, the takeover by the rebel groups was Israeli-led. And I think we need to counter that. We need to say that the Syrian revolution started led by Syrians, and it ended also led by Syrians. And of course, there's foreign influence, etc. But we need to give credit to the agency and also not to overemphasize that axis of resistance, which has actually collapsed in the last year and not allowed any support to the Palestinians. Now, Syria has been weakened, but also I believe the Israelis have always had this doctrine of engaging with their neighbors from a point of domination or force. And I believe this is what he's trying to show, the new government. And again, for me, the backlash might be in the mid to the long term to the Israeli society, but also to the Israeli government.
Yeah.
If I may add something, Khalil, on that.
Please go ahead.
This is very quick. Yeah. I just want to mention that Syrians fought Israel decades before the coming of the Assad regime. We have been fighting Israel since even before 1948. Don't forget that the leader of the Great Palestinian Revolution in 1936 was a Syrian.
Mm-hmm.
So many people now are arguing whether this will actually, the collapse of the Assad regime will change the alignment of Syria or its position vis-a-vis Israel. I think we will actually view Israel as an enemy as long as it's occupying Arab land, whether that be in Syria or in Palestine or in Lebanon or in any other Arab country. So let that be clear, actually, that Syrians will not. Syrians did not actually rose against Bashar al-Assad because of his foreign policy. Let's make that clear. We actually fought Bashar al-Assad because of his crimes against Syrians, because of his brutality, because of the corruption of his regime, because of the way he has been actually administering and ruling Syria, he and his father for the past 5 decades. So this has nothing to do with Israel. This has nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict. This has to do completely with the way this regime has been ruling the country for the past 5-6 decades.
Okay, Natasha, would you like to add anything to that?
No, I mean, I think all sort of excellent points here. Prior to the revolution, I spent most of my time with Palestinian Syrians, so I can assure you that they were some of the most disproportionately harmed populations by the Assad regime. There was a prison called Fatah Palestine, or the Palestine branch in Syria. And so, I mean, I think part of the reason that the Assad regime was able to stay in power for so long is because they knew how to color in the lines. I think from Israel's perspective, and this has become more obvious in recent months, they use the corruption and the ineptitude of the regime to really break down silos and commit a lot of the attacks that they have on Hezbollah. They were able to get a lot of intel from Syria and on Hezbollah through Syria. So, I mean, I think now the question is that uncertainty for them. They don't know if whatever this government will be, will color in the lines, so to speak. But I think it goes without saying that a Jordan, a Lebanon, well, maybe a Lebanon, but certainly a Jordan and a Syria would not be pleased, with a lot of what Israel is doing. And so, I think that this will be a sort of a significant spoiler effect. Again, I think for Syria in the future, not just for its own security, sovereign security, but I think for real, truly inclusive democracy more broadly.
Thank you. I would like to also thank Naomi Weiss for her question, which I think was addressed by Radwan earlier. Her question was about whether Assad will be hunted and be brought back to trial in Syria. And Radwan, you want to add anything to that quickly, or are you satisfied with your earlier answer?
Yeah, I think it's still early, of course. What I stated before, I stated what's the thinking among the Syrians right now, and what the advantage and disadvantage if they decided to go into domestic trial or more international trials. the good thing that the international community just mentioned the need of justice and accountability, but they did not actually push the Syrian into one of those roads. Still, as I said, a long way to go before decided which path we should go. But I think this will continue to be a center focus of Syria transition in the future.
Thank you. Natasha?
Yeah, I mean, just specifically on the question of Assad being brought to trial. I'm sorry I have to drop off right at 11:30.
Right.
This has been a great discussion. I mean, I think what was interesting coming from the Kremlin was that they really tried to juxtapose how they treated Bashar al-Assad, and that was clearly a differentiation between how the United States treated its long-term allies, and I think that that was on purpose. We saw, you know, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt in a cage in a courtroom. We saw Gaddafi, who was not a U.S. ally, but certainly handed over weapons of mass destruction. And in return, he was dragged through the streets by his own people. Saddam Hussein, who was at one point supported by the United States, of course, his ultimate destiny, also not something that I think any dictator would aspire to. And so there has been some commentary on whether or not, you know, he falls out of a window, as so many people that have proven unbeneficial to Russia. You know, the fate of many has been a sort of assassination. But I do think that it was interesting that the Kremlin specifically said, we will protect our allies, right? And get them out of the country. So it might be challenging, I think, in the near term. But certainly there is probably more evidence on this regime than most to bring them to trial.
Thank you. I would like to conclude with a quick answer from Marwan to a question or a series of questions actually by Bouhlal bin Ali, asking that there will be no success in Syria unless there are guarantees somehow to freeze the remnants of the ancien regime, the old regime, from re-penetrating, if you will, or assuming power again. Do you agree with that assessment, that there will be no success unless they secure, in other words, the domestic environment?
There are a few concerns among Syrians right now. One of them actually is the regrouping of the remnants of the old regime. And because, you know, counter-revolution is always, whenever you have a revolution, you should have a counter-revolution somehow. How big and strong that counter-revolution depends on so many factors. One of them actually is how the external powers are willing actually to intervene and support some of those people actually who might actually benefit their or serve their interest. I'm talking about the interest of the external powers. So this is a major concern right now. To be frank, we're very much concerned about some regional powers that might not be very well comfortable with the change of leadership in Damascus. Some actually believe that we have a new leadership that is an Islamist, Salafist, who are now in control of Damascus, and we might actually be having some sort of repetition of the Egyptian scenario, which removed Morsi in 2013. Yes, we do have certain concerns about that. Of course, I mean, there are also major differences between Syria and Egypt, which make that scenario less likely. But then we are presented with a even more worse scenario than the Egyptian one, which is the Libyan scenario.
Yeah.
Because what we would like to see right now from the caretaking government in Damascus, the interim government, if you would like to call it, in Damascus, is to have monopoly over the use of force in Syria. Would like them actually to move as quickly as possible in order to force everybody, whether individuals or factions, to lay down arms, to submit their arms to one central government in order to prevent the probability of having either an Egyptian scenario or a Libyan scenario in this case. But I must say that there are concerns about such an eventuality.
If I may add, Khalil,
yeah,
quickly,
go ahead, real quick.
I think
Marwan.
this is why national reconciliation matters a lot in the context of the next transition. And we need to have a really inclusive process, in the meaning that also the relation to the Kurds is important, the inclusion of Kurds as Syrian citizens, the inclusion of the religious minorities, and not in rhetorics only. I think that matters a lot.
In reality.
And possibly the amnesty that was given by Jolani to the lower ranking, army, soldiers, etc., is a positive move. Now, I would link that with accountability, as we talked about, and the need to really go after those who committed the war crimes, who have detained, tortured, etc. And I think it's highly symbolic, with the help of the international justice, but also if Bashar al-Assad was tried in Damascus by the Syrian people, would be a very important step towards real reconciliation and the end of the remnants of the old regime. And I think, as mentioned by Marwan, counter-revolution always happens after revolution, but it also depends on the solidity and the structure of the transition period on all these pillars, in my view.
Perfect conclusion, Marwa. Thank you. Appreciate your being with us today. Marwan, Natasha, Radwan, all your remarks, your answers were very substantive and very informative. Appreciate your taking time out of your busy schedules and difficult time to be with us for this webinar. I'm sure we haven't answered every question possible. We might have to consider down the road a reunion, if you will, another webinar or two to try to kind of continue to explain the situation as it unfolds in Syria. On behalf of Arab Center Washington, D.C., I'd like to thank you, our audience, for joining us. We are in touch, so you stay in touch too. Thank you.